Good morning to those in the Americas, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in this special COVID-friendly virtual book launch. My name is Daouii Abouchere. I'm a geopolitical analyst by background. However, I have experience in capital markets and ESG advisory. I'm currently a global shaper at the World Economic Forum and also a presenter for the International Economic Forum and their online media partner, Bloomberg. I have the honor of being your host for this evening. Today, we're presenting the launch of German Justice by Markus Fetter. This will be an open discussion surrounding some of the issues and themes raised in this suspenseful novel. Now, without further ado, we are very fortunate to have an excellent panel, and let me introduce them to you. First, we have Dr. Annika Budeling. She's a philosopher at University of Graz in Austria. Prior to Graz, she completed a PhD in philosophy at Cambridge. Her research interests include ethics, metaphysics, and morality, and she also has real-life experience having worked as an economist in Ramallah and Tanzania. Next, we have Jean-Marc Debrecon, who's a visionary impact entrepreneur who heads the sustainable development investor, Ultrafin. His background in both development banking and investment banking. 10 years ago, he founded the NGO Green Shoots Foundation and the charity Children of the Mekong. Next, we have Meriel Schindler. She's a London-based lawyer of half Austrian descent. She has been instrumental in letting history come to life by installing the so-called Stolpcenter, pardon my butchering of that, stumbling stones in Vienna. Meriel is the author of The Lost Café Schindler, One Family, Two Wars, and the Search for Truth, a family history which will be published in 2021. Next, we have Victor Sebestyen, who's a journalist, writer, and historian who reported widely from Eastern Europe throughout the communist era. He is also the author of various historical works that cover 1946, the making of the post-war world, and the Hungarian uprising of 1956. The Fall of the Soviet Union, 1989, and the biography of Lenin. Marcus highly recommends this book. And last but certainly not least, the man of the hour himself, Markus Fetter, who is an author who grew up in Germany, where discussions of World War II were part of his childhood. You might not know this, given his insanely amazing writing, but he lived in London in many years, working as a banker and investment banking and development finance. In 2008, Marcus published his first novel, Sarabande, set in Sarajevo during the War of 1992. German Justice is his second novel. Marcus studied international relations at FU Berlin, LSE, and Cambridge. He lives in Switzerland mountains, and with the proceeds of his writing and art supporting the UK charity Children of the Mekong. Prior to delving into our exciting discussion, I would like to start by asking Marcus a couple of questions regarding German justice. So Marcus, you've had a very impressive career in banking. And one might say it's not stereotypical or conventional for a banker to become a writer. What made you want to pursue writing novels?
Very good question, Daouii. Thank you for the introduction. And let me also welcome everybody. And before I go into the question, I just want to thank the panelists, everyone, for being here today and for discussing these issues with us all. I also want to thank Mona Katzenberger, who you heard play the piano. She's playing Chopin's Mazurka, Opus 63, number 3. And when you read the book, you'll know why, or why I want to play it over here. And I also want to thank Todd Swift, the publisher, for the trust he has in this book, and for making it possible. So thank you, Todd, and thank you, everybody. Well, when you do finance is something which is very methodical, very mathematical, very straightforward, and but also in finance you need some sort of fantasy, some sort of imagination in order to do things interestingly. However, the real imagination can only be played out when you write something. And I felt like writing about this topic, about German justice, for a very long time. As you said, Daouii, I grew up in Germany, and in my childhood, I remember walking the streets and I was looking at people and I was thinking, what were you doing during the war? Were you a Nazi or not? And sometimes my mother used to point out somebody and said, look at this woman over there. She was a really bad Nazi. And at the time, I didn't really understand what it was because I was too small. But what I did find out later is that very little justice had been done after the war. People were jailed, but even mass murderers already came free in the year of 1950. Interestingly, you will probably think today, 75 years ago, the Nuremberg trials started. So this to have this book launch at the same day is an amazing coincidence for me. So I'm also quite grateful for that. However, the Nuremberg trials only put so few people behind bars or executed them. So I wanted to write about this. And in writing, it is a way of expressing and bringing ideas across, which of course you can't do in finance.
As a German, was it challenging to write this book, given the heavy history involved in it?
Well, I'm actually half German, and my father's side is Dutch. So that gave me a different perspective. But no, it wasn't difficult because as a German, you almost have a home advantage because I had access to so many people. I could speak to so many people. And I spoke to people who, like the protagonist in the book, Max, who had been in the war and who didn't want to be in the war. And nonetheless, they had been in the Soviet Union and they had been close to Volgograd or Stalingrad. So I felt with my background, I actually had a different perspective or a good perspective to write about these things.
Switching gears just a little bit over to the book. Could you tell me what compelled you to write this novel and where you drew inspiration from?
Well, I drew inspiration from two aspects. On the one hand, I felt the issue of justice had not really been resolved in Germany. So that was more of an intellectual level. And also when I went to university, I studied history, etc., and was very much interested in these topics. Secondly, I traveled. So I went to Volgograd. I went twice to Volgograd, and I spoke to people over there, and I visited all the sites. I was in Ukraine and visited sites over there. So all of this amalgamated into a big interest in this issue of the justice or the injustice of not having justice, after not having enough justice after the Second World War.
As a reader, I went through a wave of emotions throughout this book. I felt like I was on a roller coaster, feeling anger, excitement, horror at times. But as an author, I wonder, can you walk us through how you felt writing some of these heavy-hitting scenes?
Yes, I did not feel it's as heavy. When you write it, it's different. When you write it, it flows, and I can do it totally emotionless. And it's only sometimes when I reread a passage after a month or so that it hits me what this actually all implies, what this means. So the process of writing is actually a very free and liberating one. The process of reading is one where you get far more emotionally involved than when you write.
Philosophy and music play a critical part throughout this book. I'd love to know more about your approach to the choice of music.
Music is important, and in a way, the second protagonist is Xenia. So she is Russian, she lives in Moscow, and I'm not going to tell you about the details of the novel now, but for her, music is central. She's a concert pianist. And already in my first novel, The Saraband, you had music. It was a cellist who was the protagonist, and now it is a pianist. And as you can hear, or could hear earlier, Chopin's Mazurka is one of her favorite pieces as an encore after a concert. but she also plays Beethoven Rachmaninoff. And in playing, it is a contrast to her other personality. I've created her as somebody who is quite a tough person and a stroppy person and a street smart kid who grew up in really the rough areas of Moscow. But the piano side is where her soft side comes out. So that's her contrast.
Speaking of Xenia, you use such vivid imagery and bring the characters to life in such an amazing way that you almost feel like you're living the story with them. As an author, what do you think the hardest, or what was the hardest part about writing characters from the opposite sex for you?
That's a difficult question. To try to think like a stroppy 25-year-old woman who has a soft side. It's difficult to say. I think it is better for the reader to judge whether I got it right or not. Yeah, I will leave it at that.
Sounds good. It certainly is an amazing final product. And it left me a lot to ponder on and think about. What is the one hope that you feel that you want your readers to impart with from this book?
To keep open eyes for the injustice in this world. Because I don't think that after the Second World War, things stopped. You still had a war in Sarajevo, as I wrote about. You had Rwanda. You had the dreadful genocide in Cambodia. And I think the world is far too often just closing its eyes. And I think it is really necessary to keep eyes open. And Cambodia is a very good example because it's not that long ago that a quarter of the population was literally slaughtered by Pol Pot, and the world looked aside. And that is something which I found very, very moving. And that's the reason why I support the charity Children of the Mekong, where my author's proceeds will go to in this book.
Great. Thank you so much for that insight, Marcus. So with that, let's switch gears and get into our panel discussion with all our panelists. My first question is one which I've been struggling with myself. Max is a judge by profession, but throughout the novel, he assumes the role as judge, jury, and executioner. How do you feel about revenge, taking justice into one's own hand? And is this a man-made right or the inevitable?
Well, I'm very uneasy by the idea. It's so politically correct to think of an idea of individual justice, which is more like revenge than justice. So the politically correct answer would be to say, no, it's a definitely against rules. But that only applies where there are democratic institutions and proper institutions of justice. And even in a democracy that Germany was established after the war and has worked really well as a democracy, there were lapses in the judgment, despite the Nuremberg, as Marcus's book examines really very intelligently and very deftly. So there are huge grey areas, and there are big grey areas in areas where there is no democracy and in an autocracy. Is it all right to commit terrorist acts in a democracy and in an autocracy against an injustice? Well, maybe it is. These are very grey areas. And as a journalist, I covered, some wars in which there were grey areas all over the place, injustices all over the place. So it's not black and white answer. Personal revenge can be wrong, but societal revenge might be right.
If you allow me, I'd like to concur with that. And I really struggled actually looking at Max and what motivated him, because when you think about it, so he's a judge, and he has for years cherished those values of fairness and justice. And And then he decided to take justice in his own hands. And then, it kind of spirals out of control. And I think the fundamental shock for me was to see that the characters were capable to do the very same thing that the Nazis did before, which is to take someone's life. And I'm not a religious person, okay, I'm an atheist, but I do believe in the sanctity of life. As a humanist, I do believe that life should be preserved at all costs, and therefore revenge is not appropriate. You can bring someone to court, to justice, and make sure that they pay for the crimes they committed, but you should not take their life, because then you just come to the same level as what they did. You are losing something, and I think it's humanity, okay? Because this is something that is very, when you visit a concentration camp or when you visit the school Tuol Sleng in Phnom Penh, you are faced with exactly the same emotions. You find yourself in a place where humanity has been taken off, where some people have been victims of atrocities and have been treated like objects. And by doing so, the people who perpetrate that are also losing their humanity. And I think my main concern is that Max and the other protagonists, in some ways, through this revenge path, lost some of their humanity themselves. But that's just my opinion.
I think the distinction that is being made here between justice and revenge is really important, because it seems clear that Max is motivated by what one could call maybe the right motive. He wants justice. He's not interested in impressing others or closing a chapter of his own past, maybe that too, but mainly he has moral motives. But then the actual acts, maybe they are not just. So it seems that he's motivated by demanding or asking for justice, but the way he pursues his motivation might be rather unjust. So he might in the end not get what he's hoping to get, given what he does. So I think it's really helpful to keep that distinction in mind between revenge, which is what he might be doing in the end, and asking for justice.
I was also troubled by the taking of revenge into his taking of life, basically, after the war. And as you know, I'm a lawyer, so my office happens to be opposite the Old Bailey, and the above the main door of the Old Bailey there is a sort of plaque which says, or which is what the sort of, if you like, the motto of the Old Bailey, which is protect the children of the poor and punish the wrongdoer. Now that's what's above the Old Bailey, and of course, more famously, at the top of the Old Bailey is the woman of justice, who is blindfolded and holds scales and a sword. Now, obviously, justice is not always done appropriately, and I think it is to some extent about context. And I think what troubled me about the taking of life after the war was, of course, that was in a liberal democracy where I suppose Max could equally have forced a confession from the judge and then presented the confession, as opposed to taking life, without making too many spoilers, obviously. So I think revenge and justice will depend on context. Within the context, obviously, of the Second World War, there were plenty of laws and enormous number of judges applying very unjust laws. And of course, their argument after the war was, I was working within the framework, and I applied, my job as a judge was to apply the law as given to me by the government. But of course, lawyers need to be vigilant. We know that. Lawyers can't just apply the law regardless of context. They need to be super vigilant, as we have seen in this country with the Supreme Court striking down government decisions. And that is a very, very important part of a liberal democracy.
I mean, if I may just,
sorry.
if I may just jump in over here. I mean, the way Max was created is not as a amoral just killer. I mean, he on the one hand, he has no moral problems with executing a former totally unrepentant SS guy who he realizes he would never be able to get into jail. But he has the biggest moral qualms about having killed soldiers in the Second World War. And it's really this contrast of the injustice of the war with what's happening after the war. And secondly, to your point also, Jean-Marc, he does, I mean, I don't want to tell the whole story, but he does go through transformation until the very end, and which almost made the end different from what it was in the end. I don't want to tell the story of the book because you have to read it.
It's interesting, in each of your answers, you balanced the distinction between revenge and justice, and Victor, you said societal justice is right. Last July, in Germany, a former SS concentration camp guard, Bruno D., was sentenced in Germany for aiding murder in 5,230 cases. Is it right to sentence someone who was such a micro actor in the Nazi machinery after so many years have passed? I would love to hear your insights and opinions on this.
Certainly, I have no qualms about that at all. I think
Correct.
And it's worth reminding people that because of what we mentioned, Marcus mentioned the Nuremberg. For the Nuremberg cases, there was no concept of war crime. There was no law of war crimes. There was no concept of genocide. These were established as illegal under international law at the Nuremberg trials. So without them, we wouldn't be asking this question at all. But yeah, just because this guy got away with it for 70 years we should. It's always said when we talk about the Holocaust, and again, it's an element that separates what happened in the Second World War from others. The Holocaust aspect of it, as I think. That always said, "Oh, never forget, never forget." So how can we then say never forget and then let off someone when it's clearly established that he was a war criminal? I take your point about a minor. There aren't any of the major players left. If there were, I'd be going after them. Perhaps there are some in Argentina, who knows? But I very much doubt it.
I was just thinking further about the question, and I thought, if we said that it wasn't wrong for him to get this sentence now, it would mean that time and the fact that many other people committed the same atrocities as he did protected him. And that seems highly problematic. So it seems very questionable to think that it could be wrong for him to get the sentence so many years later, because then time and the fact that there were so many other people who acted just in the same way would make it okay to act like this, and that seems wrong.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, but there are people committing war crimes, atrocities, genocide now. If we take away the concept that you can always be tracked down, always you might have to come and pay, what's to stop people doing it now?
That's a very fascinating point you raised, because throughout the book, Max struggles with the notion that one day there's no normal notion of justice within war. However, at the end of the war, the next day, the world kind of reverts back to normal. And he says, when in doubt, he says in Latin, but the English translation, when in doubt, err on the side of the accused. In modern society, where does that phrase fit into our current international courts? And when we take into trials, when we take into the notion of trying historical war crimes in today's modern context? Meriel, I'll pick on
The
you.
lawyer at the house. Yeah.
Well, anyone who knows about those international trials that have taken place ever since Nuremberg would know that enormous amounts of very, very painstaking research goes into building those cases. It takes years and years and years to bring war criminals to justice. You have to put the testimony together, you have to put the evidence together. And so I believe, that justice is still being done in those courts. And, as a lawyer, I believe in the court system within the context of liberal democracies. In other places where we don't have that balancing between executive and judiciary, justice does get bent out of shape. And hence my point that lawyers have to be vigilant.
It's actually listening to the the conversation. I find it a shame that we don't have somebody representing Mossad over here, because they have done exactly the stuff which I made Max do. And when they killed the butcher of Riga, I think it was quite spectacular. But they also brought people to justice in real courts. So they did both.
Yeah, but Marcus, it's not just Mossad, okay? I mean, you had basically organizations in Israel who decided to send out people to track the Nazis, hunt them, and bring them to justice. And that I find remarkable. I would pay money for that to be applied actually to other countries, in Myanmar, in Cambodia, and to to continue to hunt the perpetrators of those atrocities. But I think, to execute the justice itself and to become the executioner, that's, I think, for me, that's the fine line. This is where you start playing their game.
Yes, Victor, you have a deep understanding of post-war development and revolutions. And since we're on the theme of justice, do you feel as though there was ever justice after the war?
Well, there was ever justice after the war. Well, in some places it was more effective than in others. I think there was a real problem after the war in denazifying Germany, which at the beginning of Marcus's book does look at. It was the Nazis had penetrated the system so far that 80% of the lawyers were Nazis. Almost all the doctors were Nazis. Almost all the symphony orchestras were packed with Nazis. All the engineers were Nazis. When you tried to denazify and rebuild the country, you found you couldn't do it without the Nazis. And what they did was they started out by planning lots of smaller Nurembergs. Then they found they were killing all the engineers, or going to get rid of all the engineers, or get rid of all the teachers. And you couldn't rebuild the society without using the Nazis. So it was a bit of that began the system that a whole load of Nazis got away with it. Apart from the fact that a lot of them were also the scientists were taken away by the Russians or the Americans or the British. So some countries did it, in the Eastern Bloc, for example, they did it even more, rough and ready way than in the Western democracies. They executed more people, took a lot of people to jail. They jailed far more people, but found the same thing. You couldn't really rebuild the societies in any. It would have been much more difficult to get yourself out of the mess after the war. I think they gave up far too quickly to try, and there was a policy of amnesia in most of the policy of amnesia seems so much easier than to keep seeking justice. So it was so it looks in disappointment. On the other hand, again, as a historian, if you look at the success in most ways that Germany has made of its post-war development, you could not get a more a democracy that's a liberal democracy that bears its record so successfully. You couldn't have had a more decent post-war system that has tried to look at its past, which other countries have not. So there is definitely a positive side to what's happened in post-war Germany, which is like a kind of model, in many ways, a model European nation.
And I would echo that, Victor.
If they'd gone for rampant denazification immediately, that might not have happened in the same way.
I mean, different countries did deal with it very, very differently. And I mean, my background, as was said at the beginning, is half Austrian. And it's fair to say that the Austrians tiptoed carefully away from the Second World War, immediately claimed they were Hitler's first victim, given the Anschluss, and basically engaged right up until about 10 years ago in collective amnesia. Every single household had a picture of Hitler. I've seen plenty of photos of Christmas trees with Hitler photos, hanging behind them. Those albums were immediately put in the attic and people tiptoed away. And then they tended to engage in a sort of level of competitive victimhood, which was, well, we had a really terrible time during the war. We starved, we were bombed by the Allies, and people died. We died in and so, how's that any different to what happened to the Jews? And there is still an element of that. If you talk to some of the older generation, which I've done, there's a lot of, we knew nothing about it, still being said. The younger generation of historians, thank goodness, has now dusted down the paperwork and understood a little bit more of what's going on. But that has been incredibly recent in Austria.
As you both noted, the art of truth and reconciliation is a difficult one to master, and many states are in the process or have not even started getting to that. Meriel, you've recently written a book about your family history and the issue of justice, or rather injustice, in Austria. Can you please provide the audience a little bit of in-depth insight into your book?
It works on different levels. It works on a personal level, which is partly about my relationship with my father, which I'll leave aside for the moment. But it also works on, it's also about the fact that my family came from Western Austria, where there were practically no Jews. I mean, it was ridiculously, they were a ridiculously small minority, and they were very largely assimilated. They were business people. Set against that tiny minority, when we've obviously just celebrated the Reichskristallnacht again, so the pogrom in early November, that was one of the bloodiest in the entire German Empire. So one of the interesting things about that is how you can have anti-Semitism in the absence of really any significant Jewish population, and such virulent anti-Semitism. Now, moving on to your question, which was about justice. Justice was not well served in Western Austria at all. The small fish did go to trial, and they got sentences. In the case of my grandfather, who was severely beaten up on Kristallnacht, they got sentences of between 6 months and 2 years. The man who actually ordered Kristallnacht, Franz Hofer, the Gauleiter who reported directly to Hitler, slipped away and was incarcerated in Dachau for a few months, and then escaped to northern Germany and died peacefully in his own bed in the 1970s, an utterly unrepentant Nazi. Everyone knew where he was. No one actually brought him to justice. So justice was not well served for the purposes of Western Austria because the main perpetrator slipped away.
Yeah, and you brought up a very interesting point earlier on where you said that people said, oh, we didn't know. And I think I've already done it in the introductory video, which I had posted. My mother always told all of us. She was 11 years old at the time of the Reichskristallnacht, and she witnessed it. And she knew. And she said everybody knew. And so it's total lie. I don't buy any of it. Natalie Vasile just made a very good comment here and saying maybe the society of tomorrow cannot be built on the secrets of yesterday. I think that's very true. That is a very, very good point. Back to you, Daouii.
Thank you guys both for your interjection. Switching gears a little bit, Annika, I would love to talk to you a little bit. As a moral philosopher, morality is central theme of the book. And as we know as a society, morality isn't often as black and white as Max likes to think it is. Should we rethink our morality on war and wartime? And I'd love to hear your input on that. You're still muted.
Can you repeat the last sentence?
Should we rethink our morality on war and wartime?
Should we rethink our morality in wartime? That is a good question. The way, or a slightly related question that you asked a little earlier was, before we actually started the panel, was whether there can be morality in wartime. And yeah, I was pondering about this question after you asked it. And it seems to me that this really depends on how we understand the question. You know, I'm thinking of people who do extremely heroic acts in wartime. They put their own life at risk to save others, as many people did who were part of the resistance. And that seems like an immensely ethical or moral act to do in wartime. So it seems that we can be moral, we can act morally in wartime. But if the question is understood as whether, say, the moral standards of what is good and what is bad and what counts as a right act and what counts as a wrong act, as a whole can be seen as morally justified in wartime, I think that is much more difficult to say, because it might just be the case that the bad outweighs the good during those times. So it seems that it really depends on how you understand the question. But certainly we shouldn't be able, or we shouldn't be allowed to tell ourselves, well, it's wartime, now we can do whatever we want to, right? So it seems that internally we have almost like a duty to live up to our moral standards, no matter what is happening in the world around us. But then another question might be, how you assess the moral standards of an entire society.
If I may add on that one, there was a very interesting event about 25 years ago in France. We had Klaus Barbie. Klaus Barbie was a Nazi who perpetrated a lot of atrocities in occupied France. And he was finally caught, but he had to be defended. And the lawyer actually who put himself forward was Jacques Vergès. Jacques Vergès was a legendary lawyer in France because he took the case of many terrorists. And the case he was always making was that, okay, morality is imposed by the winners. The view of the world from the winning point of view is becoming the morality imposed on everyone else. If you look at things from the other side, you will realize that a terrorist is not necessarily a terrorist, but a freedom fighter. Okay, and that's how he defended some Palestinian terrorists who killed some people or hijacked some planes, or same with Algerian terrorists. And of course, with Bobby, it was a bit more difficult and he didn't win. But I think it's an important aspect, is morality. Who is defining morality? And can we not agree that there is an absolute definition of morality that goes way beyond which side of the fence you are from? And I think this is where you're looking at fundamental values that we should all respect as human beings.
The additional question.
Very good point, Jean-Marc, and I would definitely subscribe to it, but you also gave me good ideas for the next book.
Mm.
The additional questions you all raised is exactly how I felt after reading this book. It seems like a Pandora box of philosophical questions that we could spend all evening talking about. But switching gears back to the book, is there a character that was your most favorite and least favorite? And I'd love to know why.
So would I.
I liked Xenia.
Yeah, me too. And that complex love affair between the two, it's very unlikely. And to start with, it just seems so impossible. I couldn't get it. But then I don't want to do any spoilers in this book, so for anyone who reads it. But continue with it because it becomes an extremely touching and moving aspect of the book that really works very well.
Annika, Jean-Marc?
Yeah, I mean, Xenia as well. And the least favorite, obviously, the Nazis.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Xenia as well. She also brings some, as Marcus already said, she brings some softness into it with the love affair, but also with her passion for music. And that really helps somehow to also, for the reader, to be open and connect to the characters.
And I'd love to add as well, Misha. I feel that he's the rational friend that I think we all desperately need. So hearing his rationality and seeing it play out throughout the book was one of my favorites.
Yeah.
I'd also love to understand, given your respective and very diverse backgrounds, whether it be your personal, familial backgrounds or academic, what emotions did this book invoke in you?
I think the strongest emotion for me was feeling pulled in opposite directions with regards to Max, the main character. And I found myself trying to somehow bring things into alignment constantly, but I didn't quite get there because on the one hand, he does seem to have, we touched on this before, he does seem to have a moral compass and he does seem to act for good reasons, but then what he does, I could only disapprove of it. And so I think the strongest emotion had to do with this ambivalence that I felt towards him, which is of course greatly done because you certainly don't get bored.
Thank you.
Meriel?
Yes, I worried about the fate of justice versus revenge, so I felt quite anxious all the way through. Plus I liked the Xenia plot line, and I liked I very much enjoyed the journey back into the past, the driving through the Ukraine, and that sort of element of it I thought was really, really interesting. Swimming in the lakes, lying in the fields. I really liked that bit, that sense of journey.
Yeah, I go along with that. It was the looking at the past, and very subtly looking at it. And I was discomforted by the justice versus revenge aspect, and it's a very interesting way of looking at that philosophical thing and the idea of collective guilt as opposed to personal guilt, because there was a lot of people felt collective guilt against, that early on after the war against Germany. But then it was a famous philosopher who put it the best, and this book looks at this issue quite carefully. It was when everyone is guilty, no one's to blame. It was Hannah Arendt's great thing about the Nazis, and I thought Marcus's book puts that argument in novelistic terms really well.
And so the French side of my family is from Haute-Marne, and during the Second World War, obviously they got stuck there, and then eventually found it a great idea to move towards Antwerp. And my grandmother was from there. With the V1s and V2s falling down then they eventually thought that's not such a great idea. Let's go towards the south of Belgium. So they were in the region of Bastogne just when you had the counter-offensive. So, and not great. My mom was telling me that at the time she was maybe 10 years old, and bringing soup to the wounded American soldiers that were in the church. And you could hear them moaning from pain. And they were giving the kids chocolates and chewing gums, and the kids had never seen that before. And it was amazing. And in those days, of course, then you had this aura, this prestige of America. And for many years, Germany did not enjoy that. I still remember when my grandmother watching TV was swearing when Boris Becker was playing. So it's quite remarkable, I think, to see the transformation that we have, the fact that we can be friends, that we are not just friends, but we are allied nations, that we have embraced each other, we have forgotten about the past. I mean, we have forgotten about the bad bits of the past, but we have fully embraced our past to construct the future together. And this is the beauty of Europe. It's peace. I mean, Europe was a mess during Second World War. And the greatest achievement, sadly completely overlooked by Brexit, is peace. And this is what we should really embrace, celebrate, and continue to nurture, because that's the most important.
Well, hooray for that. That's totally right. That's been the greatest legacy of the Second World War and of the Nazi period. That's the peace within most of Europe that after centuries, not just a short period. And hooray for what you've just said.
But we can only have peace if we keep history alive. And I fear that history is getting more and more forgotten. And one of the questions which came up is what do you want to achieve by writing this book? It is actually keeping history alive. History can be kept alive in many forms. You can have museums, you can have statues somewhere, and you can also have novels and films. So this is one contribution. Maybe it will become a film. I hope so.
Yeah, good. It'll make a good movie.
That would be an amazing movie, certainly. Jean-Marc, you raised a very interesting lesson that could be deduced from the Second World War. Are there any other lessons we could learn from this book? I'll start with Annika.
Yeah, one point that came up in our discussion as well seems central to me, and that's that things are complicated and messy, and certainly not as black and white as they are regarded by some. And keeping that in mind, and I guess looking at history also makes a good case for this. So in philosophy, sometimes there's that tendency to abstract entirely from the messiness of real life. And so bringing philosophy and moral questions really in touch with history or real life, that just is a very good material to show that things aren't black and white.
Certainly. Meriel?
We've spoken quite a lot about the book being about sort of justice and revenge and the difference between the two. The bit we probably haven't touched on is it's also about remorse, and the distinction between, those who actually experience remorse and those who don't, and what that tells you about them. And I think that's actually very interesting, because I think we probably haven't touched on that quite so much in this discussion, is what remorse does, and does it justify, does it provide defense, or is it an entirely personal emotion? Does it liberate the person from the crime, the fact that they suffer remorse, or does it not? And I think that's also a very interesting theme that runs through the book.
Certainly, and we see the main protagonist, Max, grapple with that concept.
And not just him, of course. There is another player in the book who pops up right at the end in my alternative hometown of Innsbruck, he is reacting differently to his past. So I think that is a very interesting theme that comes through the book.
Certainly so. Victor?
Well, I think the idea that eventually, messily and horribly, as Annika might have said, your past can catch up with you, is one of the messages from the book.
That's a very interesting concept.
In modern day language, you would say karma is a bitch.
Or karma's not so much of a bitch. Karma's nature.
Very interesting. I would have put it a little lighter myself. Focusing back on you as the chairman of the charity that all the proceeds from this book is going to. The Children of the Mekong is still active in Cambodia. Are there any parallels that you see?
Oh, huge. Let's look actually at what Pol Pot did. I mean, Marcus mentioned it earlier on. What he tried to do was to destroy a civilization. And he started by destroying education, knowledge. Why? Because knowledge is resistance to what he was attempting to do, which is totally control the society. And so bring it down to the ground zero. So he destroyed all the schools, the hospitals, the factories, the roads, and then started killing people who had knowledge. This is why you had people, I mean, the first person I met in Cambodia, Papi Soy, wonderful man who still today works for the charity in Cambodia. And he had to hide in the fields for many years, okay? And he could not talk to anyone because that would have betrayed the fact that he was someone who was educated. He could not show his hands because they would have seen they were not a farmer's hands. And it just tells you how horrendous that regime was. And even more so, I mean, they tried to take kids and condition them to kill the parents of their friends or their own parents. So, it's totally similar. I mean, it's the same thing. And as I said earlier on, when you visit a concentration camp or you visit the school in Phnom Penh where all these people were detained and where today you can still see the photographies of the victims, because you have to know that before they killed them, they took a picture of them. So that's what you see. You see pictures, faces of men, women, children on the walls. The feelings that you go through are the same in all these places where these atrocities were committed. So what can we do about it? Well, we can and we should promote education. We should promote knowledge. We should ensure that everybody embraces those values of respect, of life, of the others, of tolerance, and that they can build their own future. They can provide for their households, for their families. And they don't need to do that hurting other people. The charity is about education. So we try to send kids back to school. We try to provide additional tuition to them. And we do that for kids of ethnic minorities, kids of the Karen communities in Myanmar, or kids of local communities that are very impoverished, like the ones we're supporting in Cambodia, mostly in the rural regions. Children of the Mekong is the British charity of Enfants du Mekong, which was set up more than 60 years ago and operates in all the Southeast Asian countries. And you have hundreds of thousands of kids who have been able to build a future, an alternative to working in the fields or worse, by being able to get an education and then provide for their families, provide for their siblings, for their parents, look after them, build a future, and do other fantastic things. And I think that's the most important. You know, it's about education, it's about empowerment. That's what the charity is about. And if anybody feels open to the idea, please check out the website, childrenofthemekong.org. Consider the possibility of sponsoring a child, because this will be a huge impact, not just for that child, but for the whole family and for the community.
As you say, Jean-Marc, it's such critical, crucial, and vital work that the charity is doing, and I think that's one of the reasons Marcus chose it as his charity of choice. So thank you all, cognizant of time, thank you all for your contributions and interesting take. I can speak for myself, and many of you, I think, would agree that we could chat about some of the themes raised throughout this book all night long. However, I know it's a Friday night and some people would like to get on with their busy lives. So thank you all again. The music you heard at the beginning is the Chopin Mazurka that Xenia has played throughout the book. It is recorded by Mona Katzenberger. Thank you, Mona, for your contribution. And thank you to our panelists for engaging with us today and answering my questions. And last but not least, thank you to you at home for tuning in and joining us as we celebrate Mr. Fetter and the launch of German Justice. The link to purchase the book is posted. A special reminder, please order from the publisher's online bookshop, as the author's share from the book sales will be donated directly to the children of the Mekong. Marcus, would you like any last words or a last bow?
I want to thank everybody. It was a really interesting discussion, and maybe the viewers now have the impression that this is all just really, really heavy legal debate and legal things. No, it's actually quite a lot of some fun aspects to it. There's some killing. There is a lot of wine drinking, etc. So Max and Xenia are actually human beings, and I hope you will enjoy them. So wish you all the best. Thank you very, very much for listening. It's great to see so many people. I see friends from US, Canada, Europe, Asia. God, it's so early in the morning for the people who are dialing in from Asia. So thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you all for participating, and please make sure to share your thoughts and comments on social media with us, #GermanJustice. Until next time, guys, have a blessed evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you, Marcus.
Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Good book, great book.
Bisous, Marcus.
Thank you, Marcus. That was wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marcus.
Thanks, Marcus. Good weekend, all.
Bye.
Markus, danke, tschüss.
Oh.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you so much for choosing Children of the Mekong as well.
Welcome.
Bye. Congratulations.
Bye.